I'm sure you remember it. It was late August of 2005. Hurricane Katrina was nearing the state of Louisiana. I was a young pastor, fresh out of seminary, just learning the ways of pastoral life. And pretty quickly in the community that I was a part of, right in the middle of the state, we began to receive folks who were fleeing this horrendous storm. And at first it was just a trickle, but pretty quickly there were thousands of people leaving the New Orleans area into the Alexandria area to be able to save themselves from this terrible storm. And pretty quickly the congregation that I was a part of began to provide care for these communities that were gathering all around us. And pretty soon we were not just, helping with water and clothing and things. We were also deploying ourselves as pastors. We were going to the places where they were to provide care for these people who were going through so much. I found myself spending my days walking hallways of dormitories and hearing the stories. Hearing the stories of those who left early, but very quickly hearing the stories of those who left a little late. Stories of devastation, stories of struggle, stories of not knowing what would come next, what's happening all around us. And I remember one night after a long day, arriving home, putting my head on the pillow around midnight and just weeping. This young pastor, overwhelmed with the needs all around me. We know that feeling, don't we? I didn't have a name for it back then, but I have a name for it now. We've been hearing it in these pandemic days. Compassion fatigue. Maybe you felt that compassion fatigue in your own life. As you've cared for others, maybe you're a new parent and you're overwhelmed, compassion fatigue. Maybe you are a healthcare worker and still struggling with all this pandemic stuff. You have compassion fatigue. Maybe in the midst of all that is going on in our world right now, at this moment, you try to help others find their way. You try to recenter others in a loving, compassionate way. You are feeling that compassion fatigue. And that fatigue can make our hearts hard. That fatigue can make us cynical. That fatigue can make us be a people who maybe turn away from that compassion. It's so easily can happen to any of us. And you've seen examples of that too on social media where people attack one another, people who maybe mean well, but they get really ugly with one another. Or you might feel that anger rising from you at something that happened at your workplace or something that happened in the marketplace. Or, hey, even something that might have happened right here in church. Someone said something, or someone had a weird look about something, or someone gave you the side eye, and you're feeling this overwhelming sense of life, fatigue. So imagine in the midst of fatigue, when we hear this letter of Paul reminding us of something. Do not grow weary. Do not grow weary from doing good. But what do you mean, Paul? I am weary of doing good. I want to approach the stuff that I'm experiencing in my life in a different way. I'm worn out of compassion. I'm worn out of love. I'm worn out of trying to find a better way. Paul knew this. I know this. It is indeed difficult. That is why he reminds us of this. Because so often in our lives, when we are really attempting to come alongside, to live in solidarity with neighbor, when we're really attempting to to be fully present to those that we encounter, when we become a people who really seek to be nonviolent in the world, who seek to bring people together and to be part of conversations, and to be a people who don't react but respond, to be a people who make space for folks to be able to find ways together, to live life together as communities. It does get to those points sometimes. It is part of what it means to be human. All of us have that point in our own souls where we grow weary. Paul knew this. I know this. We know this. The question for us is, what do we do here? In other words, where's the good news in the midst of living in weary days? And where is the good news as we seek to be a community that truly companions one another in good times of joy and strength, and in difficult times? What do we do here? Or Paul reminds us in Galatians from the very beginning that part of what matters is from what center are we leading into. And I know that young pastor was weary partially because I was giving and giving and giving and giving and hearing and hearing and hearing and hearing and trying to be present without giving myself any space, any margin, any boundary to kind of refresh my soul. And sometimes we do that in our own lives. We give and give and give and don't give ourselves any space of recharging, any community of joy, any opportunities for love. We just give and give and give. And so one of the things that we're reminded of on this day is that life in the Spirit helps us create those opportunities. So one of the ways in which we could become a people who do not grow weary from doing good is by finding communities of joy, communities of recharging, communities of love, communities of beauty. And it depends on each one of us. We all have ways in which we recharge, but we do need to reconnect with our true selves and with each other in those ways. And that begins to build a sense, a deeper well from which we can then continue to do good in the world. We also need to watch, kind of keep a barometer on that cynicism and that tough heart that settles in our souls when things are not going well. Recognize when we're reacting and not responding, and that requires a community of accountability around us. I'm really thankful for colleagues and loved ones back in those days who helped me find a center again. Yes, we need those to remind us that we're human and that other is a human too. People who remind us to humanize one another, to look at each other in the eye, even especially in difficulty, and to do that good work together. Paul reminds us that we need to be careful with the self-centeredness, the works of the flesh. We discussed this together a week or so ago, but those works of the flesh are that self-centeredness that we tend to live into sometimes in our lives. And when our anxiety rises and we're afraid or we're exhausted, we tend to get hyper self-centered, and that actually what it does the opposite of what we want it to do. So be careful with that hyper self-centeredness, that hyper individualism, and instead lean on the community, lean on the other, and begin to find life and love in the midst of that other, in the midst of that community. It turns out that we also are helped in not growing weary when we live life together. It's easy to live our lives as just individuals, even in doing good in the world, but doesn't it always feel better when we do the work in community? So what would that look like for us to go into our world and seek goodness with other fellow sojourners along the way? That way you have one another to kind of talk about what you've experienced, and You can talk about the encounters you're having, and you can have conversations about the ways you're feeling about this whole thing. And see, together, we're better. And we together as a community called the church, too, are stronger when we seek good in the world together as a community. I know these are difficult days, and that so many of us are weary and worn. I know that we would love to give it back in kind. We would love to be able to, if they scream at me, I'm going to scream at you. If they call me names, I'm going to call you names. If you're being negative, I'm going to be negative. But the reality is that doesn't work. See? It doesn't work. That just perpetuates the cycle of dehumanization. That perpetuates the cycles of struggle. That perpetuates the cycle of violence. So we must help one another continue to do good in the world. And even when we're calling out, or as some colleagues and friends of mine like to call it, calling people in, even when we're pointing at the injustices and the struggles, even when we're pointing at the places in our society that are not going in the way they should, for all of us as people of love and compassion in the world, we do so in a way that humanizes, in a way that connects, in a way that helps neighbor see possibility and hope. And so we committed to not growing weary for doing good. Committed because we have each other. Committed because the Spirit of the living God is with us, at work, fueling our imaginations for joy and gratitude and hope and new life, not just for us, but for the world. That night, I did need to weep. But the next day came, and I rolled out of bed and joined fellow pastors in continuing to listen to a community that was hurting. There's still people hurting in our communities. Let us join hands together and not grow weary from doing good. Together, helping people experience good news, hope, joy, new life, kingdom imagination through us. One step at a time, one day at a time, one encounter at a time. We, God's people, we guided by the Spirit who is love. Thanks be to God. Amen.